You know the way you often you can't tell people they failed anything these days. You know, it's a sort of a stigma. Believe it or not, the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was to fail an examination. And I failed Cambridge entry at the end of 1970. In those days, if you wanted to attempt an Oxbridge examination, you did so in the 3 months after A-level, so sort of September to November of the year following. The net result was that it delayed me a year in going up to university, and I ended up going to where I was always destined to go to, which was University College London, arguably the most prestigious college for statistics. Imperial was well coming up in those days too, and might have jostled for that spot. Perhaps the case of Cox versus Lindley. But nonetheless, it left me with a little bit of time on my hand, because from January until the end of September 1971, I would have been unemployed, except I wasn't. And believe it or not, it wasn't the grade A's in maths and physics that got me my first job. It was the grade C in chemistry. And I ended up working in a building that's part of this university. Now, these days, you'll know this as the School of the Built Environment. It's sort of geography and archaeology and that kind of thing. But in 1971, it wasn't. In 1971, it was part of agriculture. It was Queen's Agriculture, although it also employed some of the Department of Agriculture staff as well. It was always a bit confusing as to who you actually worked for. I was employed by Queen's. My contract was with Queen's. Anyway, a couple of stories to tell about working in there. I was actually working on field experiments. And so I had my first introduction to factorial experiments. And they were 3 by 3 by 3 by 2. 3 levels of phosphates, 3 levels of potassium, 3 levels of nitrates, and 2 levels of slurry. You all know what slurry is, don't you? Yes. I have a couple of stories to tell, because obviously I was working as a lab assistant and a field assistant on the studies, but there were a few odd things went on. Friday afternoons we finished slightly early, and the method of analysis of them, by the way, it was graph samples we were taking. The method of analysis was old wet chemistry, titrations and colour. You know, how the colour changed. You know, you got the end point, and you recorded where that end point had, and the calculation was done from that. None of this automated. On a Friday afternoon, running a wee bit late, we have one sample done. We were supposed to do everything in duplicate. My boss, Hubert, would come in and say, just give him 0.7 more for the second result. The second analysis wasn't done at all. Now, somewhere behind it all, Colin Weatherup was working away as the chief statistician in the Department of Agriculture. And I often wonder if he ended up with second, third and fourth level interactions significant, because the replicates were far too close together. And of course, in those days, it actually tells a little bit about the history of statistics here, because we were well up in terms of analysis of variance. Analysis of variance had basically been invented in the 1930s, largely through agriculture, the Rothamsted stations and places like that in England. And so that's the kind of methodology that was being used for analysis. That was the first bit of abuse that went on in this particular building. The other, and I hate to tell the Northern Ireland story, but agriculture was largely employed Protestants. There were 2 token Catholics in the place. One had a reasonably senior job, and he got on okay. He was a very moderate Catholic. He had joined the newly formed Alliance Party. And all that went on was that the rest of the people there all tried to encourage him to make the final step to join the Unionists. You know, Alliance wasn't good enough to try and get him across the Unionists. That was, I think his name was Jerry, and he was a lab manager. The other guy, whose name I can't remember because he was always called Mickey, because he delivered samples and so on. And that's the sort of utterance that was made through open windows across the courtyard to him. Hey! So it sort of tells us a little bit. I know it was all taken in fairly good fun and so at the time, but it does tell us of some of the things that we used to do that really would not be tolerated these days. Now, I tell this story because particularly the one on lab management and so on, I'm going to come back to a little bit later on, because actually the abuse of that did actually have a profound effect on me later on in life. So, let's move on through the university years and into first employment. Now, a lot of people wonder, why did he never have a PhD? Let me tell you something about statisticians in those days. If you went to university to do a full statistics degree in 3 years, then you really could come out and start applying that there and then. So it's notable that the people that I met along the way either had at most a master's because they'd done a full-blooded statistics degree in somewhere like London or Birmingham or whatever. The alternative route into statistics tended to be to do a different discipline as your first degree and then do a PhD in a statistically related subject. So the statisticians that I brushed shoulders with tended to have come one route or the other. I was one of those, and this was 1974, and as you will see in a minute, inflation and recession and so on were dark clouds on the horizon at this stage, and neither I nor one of my colleagues took the chance to stay on at university and do a postgraduate degree. The thought was you could stay on and do a postgraduate degree and there mightn't be a job for you if you waited 2 years. So I literally left university on the 21st of June 1974 and started work here in Short Brothers in Harland the following Monday. Short Brothers in Harland, they really wanted me to be an accountant. In fact, I ended up with a bluffer's diploma in accountancy. I only got it after it actually left Short Brothers in Harland, but the sort of management accounting and discounted cash flow and things like that, highly mathematical of course, but are they statistical? There were a few statistical issues, however, that they got me to get involved in. The first was really quite an important one. Now you'll recognise these two characters. They're probably not plotting a score draw, but nevertheless, they would have an interesting time going head to head. Now, that's what a football pools coupon looked like in the 1970s. Why would my first job be forecasting next Saturday's score draws? Well, you see, once Short Brothers in Harland or the commercial department that I ended up in found they'd got a full-blooded statistician, somebody who knew something about probability, the first thing they wanted was somebody to come up with a scheme for score draws. Now, actually, I used Maroney's book on facts and figures, which, very nicely tells you that goals in football matches are a Poisson distribution. And I simply made one minor adjustment to it. I said, let's assume that the rate of scoring for the home team is lambda 1, and the rate of scoring for the away team is lambda 2. And from that, you could then construct the probability of any result, including all the scored draws, 1-1, 2-2, 3-3, 4-4, and so on. The interesting thing about it was this, that actually when you start doing this, you find that there's no match that has a terribly small chance of a draw, and there's no match that has an enormous chance of a draw either. The draw is a great leveler. Even Man City end up with a draw at home against somebody who is perhaps regarded as a lesser mortal, and this goes on all the time. And of course, what's the other aspect? Well, all the likely score draws, well, they're the ones all the punters will go for. So if you did end up getting your 8 score draws, you're going to have to divide your money among so many others. So in the end, I had to tell them, look, that's how it works, but actually you're better just randomising it and in fact going for a few of the unlikely ones. And by the way, folks, exactly the same applies to the National Lottery. Don't go for the numbers up to 31 because everybody uses them as the numbers for people's birthdays. Overweight into the numbers above 31. You haven't a greater chance of winning, but if you do win, you'll share your money amongst less. There you are, first lesson of working life. Second lesson, order. I was asked to come up with a formula of estimating material and wage escalation. And the point where I had joined Short Brothers and Harland was just there. You see the arrow? And you see what happened to UK inflation. Now, it was all very nice at first. I was using linear regression to try and predict ahead. By the way, I'd read another book that sort of said, don't do this. This is little better than, forecasters and fairy tellers and so on. And actually, I have to say, I agree with that. But that's what they wanted me to do. And of course, when I got to here, you were predicting 35% next month. Then there was a sudden change in the incomes policy of the then Labour government, I think it was. And they started to slowly but surely get inflation back under control. But trying to predict inflation at that particular point in time was not easy. So, anyway, a year and a half later, they were still trying to make an accountant of me in Short Brothers and Harland. I was still hankering after applying all the stuff that University College had taught me, because I had a fairly wide remit in the undergraduate degree. Anything from experimental to design, to decision analysis, to time series analysis, to analysis of variance, which was probably the one I liked best. In particular, I had an interest in analysis of variance when the components of variation were random. We'll see that in just a minute. So, 12th of January 1976. This picture's taken a bit before. This picture would be a decade before that. That is almost certainly York Street in the mid-1960s. And how do I know that? Remember the last talk I gave about steam trains and the such like? Well, in those days, York Street was also connected by trolley buses. And the trolley buses ended on the 12th of May 1968. And if you look carefully at that photograph, you can basically see the gantries for the wires are still there. So I'm dating this picture as pre-1968. Anyway, if I put my arrow there, there's where I ended up working in Henry Street. Now, by the way, when I put the arrow there, can others on the web actually see it? Very good. Well done. Okay, let me do that again. Then I'll just put the cursor there. So in fact, if anything, my office would have been just off but it was the top end, the north end of of Henry Street. So, what sort of things do we get up to there? Well, first of all, just before I tell you about what we got up to, let me tell you a little bit about Gallaher. I know you all probably think Gallaher, that was a wicked tobacco industry, wasn't it? Actually, as my grandmother, who was then still alive, once said to me, they're a great company to work for. If you had, the best thing you could ever do was to get a job with Gallaher's but not take up smoking. Then you had all the pluses of well-paid employment and very well looked after as an employee. I mean, I used to have an annual health check from them, just in the company itself. But don't take up, just don't use the product, or at least don't inhale it. Don't inhale it, whatever you do. Anyway, at that time, the whole smoking and health question, of course, was up and coming, as was the start of what we'll call product modification. When I joined Gallaher's, they had the lowest tar cigarette on the market. That was called Silk Cut, and it at that stage had a tar yield of around 9 milligrams, which actually roundabout equals the highest tower on the market today. So there's quite a lot of research and development going on, and it was the research and development wing that I joined. Now, let me tell you about some of the people in it. The head of the group was a chap called Dr. Bertie O'Neill, or James Albert O'Neill. Now, he was amongst those who had not done statistics as a first degree. He had done a PhD in dose-response modelling with Underfinney in Aberdeen. Bertie looked after the statistics group, the toxicology group, which actually was involved in mouse skin painting and these dose-response things and so on. Gilbert's sitting over there. He'll remember Hazel McCune. She studied, I think, alongside you at the Belfast College of Technology, and she would have been the chief statistician involved in that wing of things. Now, I wasn't involved in that part of the business to start with anyway, till it started to contract a wee bit, and then I got more on my plate. But where I was run, it was the statistics section was run by a chap called David Smale. He was English, came, I think it was Birmingham University. He was from Tewkesbury in the West Country anyway. And he had two senior statisticians working for him, myself and a girl called Christine. Christine and an assistant called Aileen looked after the sort of more the biostatistics, and I inherited what was called laboratory statistics. So I looked after what went on in the smoking labs and so on, and also sensory evaluation. That was the other bit. Come to some of the things we did in a minute. Now, with so many statisticians around, and there were more statisticians in Gallaher than there were in Queen's University at that stage, David and Bertie were very much instrumental in the setting up the Northern Ireland Local Group in 1974, and they got me involved too pretty well on joining Gallaher's, because I was elected as a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society in 1976. And then the next thing was we started to get involved with the Irish Association of Statistics, or statisticians. And take a minute just to tell one or two stories about the first conference, which took place in Blessington in 1981. Now, certainly David Smale and I were present at it. I can't remember if Bertie and I think Bertie was there, or for part of the time. But it was rather interesting because we're in a building here that used to be the Department of Economics in Queen's University. That's what the Peter Froggatt Centre started off as. And Janet Truesdale worked in this building. And Bertie, David and myself all used to aid out in this building on a Friday afternoon. You see, another of the nice things about Gallaher was you worked 8 hours a day, Monday to Thursday, 4 hours on the Friday, 36-hour week, and that was it, 4.5-day week. Now, one of two things people did on a Friday afternoon. They either went to the pub and got drunk, or they came here and taught economics students statistics, So actually that was how my association with Queen's continued. But also we had the interesting thing that Janet actually was originally from England. She was married to a chap from Northern Ireland, and David Smale from England. And it was rather amusing at that first meeting in Blessington in March 1981, because, of course, we've got to think back. 1981, the Troubles were at their peak here in Northern Ireland. It was the year of the hunger strikes. There was no love lost for, shall we say, things royal, in inverted commas. And a lot of the discussion, and it was in an evening discussion meeting after some libation had been had. And, of course, it got into a relatively heated debate about whether any statistical association in Ireland could, if you like, be connected to the Royal Statistical Society, or if it have to be entirely independent. Now, David Smale took the view of, no, we'll get rid of Royal like that, whereas Janet Truesdale very much took the opposite view. It was interesting that here we had two English people getting into an age-old discussion which was just like as if it was two from Northern Ireland on the opposite sides of the divide. And I shan't tell you what the conversation was like on the train home the next day when Janet Truesdale leathered into David to tell him just what she thought about it all. Anyway, despite that, we all remained friends, and shall we say, the Conference for Applied Statistics in Ireland was eventually born. Gilbert had a lot to play, a big role to play there. I think is still alive and well. One thing actually is rather interesting that I will say about the conference in those days, if you ever went to it, it was wholly male dominated. Janet Truesdale was one of the few ladies present. If you have a meeting of statisticians nowadays, it's almost certainly a female majority. So again, it's another of those disciplines, like dentistry. Again, another one that was totally male driven. It's now 2/3 female. Anyway, that's what Gallaher's was like in the wider. One thing, we weren't under RAE exercises or anything like that, so we didn't tend to publish an awful lot. We were not restricted on giving talks at conferences and so on, but it just wasn't high on our agenda to publish things. So actually, while I was in Gallaher, I only published one paper. I'll come to that. I hope. Okay. Now, this is a modern version of a linear smoking machine. If you look very carefully at the picture, it says Cerulean at the end of it. This is what the company Filtrona has now become. But in my day, it was a company called Filtrona that supplied all your components and so on for smoking laboratories. And we had what were called 20-port linear smoking machines. If you were analysing a brand, what we would actually do is we would run it on 5 separate runs. There would be 19 different cigarettes or cigarette brands on one run, and one control brand. A control brand would be one made under special circumstances so that the variation was much less, and it would be used for your quality control. But one of the first things that I had to sort out was the fact that at this stage, the people that used the results from these smoke, who were obviously, by the way, many of whom had a chemistry background. We had people who had originally been in ICI and places like that. And at the time that I came in, the view on variation, I would say, was blinkered. It was short term, and it got them into trouble. Oh, I thought I had another slide in there. Can I just go one more on to see if... No, it's not all right. I thought I had an additional slide in there. Okay, let me just talk about this one then. What I did was to start to look at the variation of these results with a wider view. So we brought into consideration short and long-term machine variation, short and long-term production variation, and therefore added all these components together and then gave people a sheet of, what were more reasonable limits to apply. I think my analysis of this was that the limits they were applying were about half what they needed to be, because the product did change from one manufacturing cycle to another. The smoking machine would change a bit from one run to another, and indeed from 1 month to another. So this all had to be taken into consideration. So that was the first thing that was necessary to look at. The next thing, do you know the way you sort of only have 1 or 2 bright things you ever do really in your whole academic life? And I sat down one afternoon to try and solve the problem because I knew all about linear regression and how least squares worked. But it struck me that in what we were doing, you see, in Gallaher's, we analysed our brands, but so did the laboratory of the government chemist. And in fact, the laboratory of the government chemist was the official result. So if you think they were really the X and we were the Y, if at all you were going to have a linear regression, They would have to be the fixed one and we'd have to be the random one. But that was not true. We both had variation because of all the things I've said. By the way, when I was coming to put components of variation on, nowadays we'd call it G theory, wouldn't we? Breaking something down into all its random components of variation and then putting them back together again. It's basic. We've got a new term for it. It's called G theory. Just didn't know it was called that in those days. So anyway, I remember one afternoon sitting down and solving from first principles the problem of what do you do whenever there's variation in both X and Y. And then a number of months later, suddenly finding that I'd merely repeated what was in Kendall and Stewart. Quite pleased that I came to exactly the same conclusion as them. I got the fact that in order to solve it, you needed at least to have lambda, the ratio of variation on Y to variation on X, as long as you had that. But, of course, once I got lambda, I said, we're in a situation here where there are two laboratories, they're very similar entities, they're trying to do the same thing, they're measuring the same products, or array of products, so we're almost certainly looking at lambda either equal to 1 or very close to 1. But if you have a functional relationship with lambda equal to 1, then that's essentially equivalent to a regression about the 45-degree line. And if any of you know the sort of cos and sine features of 45 degrees, if you rotate something through 45 degrees and then multiply everything through by the square root of 2, you basically get the equivalent of the difference against the sum. But what's a Bland and Altman plot? It's the difference against half the sum, because it's the mean, and there's only two of us involved. So I had wrestled and come up with a nice solution, but just look how neater the Bland and Altman. The Bland and Altman is equivalent, in essence, to what I was doing, but neater. And of course, when we were having our meetings with the laboratory of the government chemist and so on, we effectively did Bland and Altman plots because we would actually plot the biases, the differences between what LGC had got and what we had got on each individual brand. By the way, if you do the functional relationship, and then you want to find out, well, have we actually got equality here? Or have we got basically Y equals X? You actually come up with elliptical confidence limits because your alpha and beta are correlated. It's not a circle, it's an ellipse. And if the values alpha equals 0 and beta equals 1 then fall within the elliptical confidence limits, then you've pretty well got a case where there's equivalence between the two measures. Okay, next thing we had to wrestle with was that 20th cigarette, the control one. It would be run on every run. It would have, for a short chart, it would have a target value because we'd have analysed a lot of whenever the run was made up to start with. And then we would run both Short charts, but we also got into running QSUM charts. Short charts, by and large, were of little use to us all because you've got to have a big departure from norm to actually fall off the end of it. And that did not happen very often. What was more likely to affect your laboratory was that you get a move, half a standard deviation, half a milligram of TARP, something of that amount, in one direction or the other, slowly over time. So this was useless at detecting that. This was quite good. So we became a champion of QSUM charts. And it's interesting that until recently we were still teaching QSUM charts on one of the postgrad courses here. The only disadvantage of QSUM charts, of course, is this. It's basically QSUM charts have a memory, whereas the short chart hardly has a memory at all. There's the case where if two results go plus 2 standard deviations in the same direction. There's a little bit of a memory in there, but there's really no memory with the Stewart chart. The QSIM chart, you are assuming there's a memory in the series. And the problem there is that when you do realize you've got a problem, you then have to go back in time. And so you have to put out the humble pie letter to your users saying, I'm terribly sorry, but we think that the results we produced over the last week or the last 2 weeks have been in error by so much. Had to do that a few times. And I've mentioned about Tar League. Just from 1972 onward, there was a 6-monthly survey of every brand on the market in the UK. And it was done by what are called match samples. So when you drew an outer from production, 1 packet would come to Gallaher labs, 1 packet would go to the laboratory of the government chemist, who ultimately ended up, I think, in Teddington. We used to have meetings in London quite often. I was, in 1979, I was promoted to be, if you like, Gallaher's rep on the tar and nicotine subgroup. So that was the first stage of me getting plenty of air miles. So we started off with the regular travel to London. The air mile race would get worse as time went on. Now, how are we doing on time? Let's move on. Got involved in sensory evaluation. Triangular difference testing involved 3 products, 2 of which are the same, 1 of which is different. You've either A and B or 2 Bs and an A. We actually had this group quite early on in the RSS's history, a chap called Holland from one of the agricultural research stations, giving a paper on the taste testing of apples. And actually it was a paper that sort of stuck with me, because basically he took a dose response approach to triangular difference testing. And that was the one paper that I wrote many years later also took this. It actually coupled probit analysis and triangular difference testing together. Another one, a little bit of amusement here. You know the way we can't analyse Likert scales with means and standard deviations? You know the way you get your hand slapped these days? Not in those days. And actually, this sort of approach was taken by, I can't remember his surname, but his first name was Keith, and he was the president of the Institute of Statisticians, and he was involved in sensory evaluation, and he never had any problem about applying means and standard deviations to Likert scales. I have to say, because of inherent problems in SPSS, I sometimes tell people just to do that anyway. Because whenever you get SPSS to do means or medians, it only gives you the whole number values. There is a way around it. Anyway, that was the type of scale we used, and the closer we got to 3.00, the better. This was a sort of one where 3 was the best. There's what dose response curves looked like. This is the sort of stuff that Hazel would have been involved in, Gilbert. That's what the dose response curve looks like. You linearize that by doing a probit transformation. And in Excel, the probit transformation is basically just that particular function there, the normal standard inverse, P being a probability. But in the early days, probits had 5 added to them. So a probit which represented 50% would have been 5, because it would have been your Z value for a cumulative 0.5, which is 0, plus 5. Doing it that way, you never ended up with a negative probit, because a probit of 0 would actually be minus 5 standard deviations. Pretty hard to get. Eventually, I ended up being in charge of those who were looking after the toxicology and mouse skin painting studies. This was actually as Gallaher started to contract a little bit into the 1980s. Now, but one day, by about 1983, we had 3 directors, and one of them was called Eddie Field. He would have been a biologist or biochemist. And there is a story here. We had employed Chris Patterson in Gallaher's until 1979, early 1980. Chris had wanted to do a master's in epidemiology, and Gallaher's ifed and butted about whether they were going to let him do it or not. And in the end, Chris left and joined here, and is still here. And so Gallaher's for a couple of years didn't really have anybody doing a lot of epidemiology. And then suddenly Eddie Field contacted me one day about 1983, and he said, "We need somebody to sit on the statistical working group. It's going to be you." So at that stage, I knew no epidemiology. This was a baptism of fire, and I had to, if you like, get up to speed. But ultimately, I suppose it was well worth it, because it was also, if you like, the means by which I eventually joined Queen's University and the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. The study that was ongoing was an industry supported study. I mean, financially supported. But the people publishing it, Alderson was a doctor. Peter Lee was an independent statistician, but did a lot of work for the tobacco industry, but also other. Actually, in some ways, the Alderson study was exactly the sort of study that ended up crucifying the tobacco industry, because it did involve an element of dose response in it, because it was looking at risk in relation to the type of cigarette smoked, and the type of cigarette smoked, of course, was low, middle, and high tar, so an element of dose response coming in here, and dose response because you could never prove causality from case control and prospective studies. Nevertheless, as you know, one of the main criteria for causality, or assumed causality, is the dose-response relationship. So, hours of fun debating and taking an interest in what was going on there. And then Peter Lee. I wonder how ethical this would be these days. Peter Lee got involved he had a theory. A lot of the very early studies on passive smoking involved wives, so-called non-smoking wives of smoking husbands. The Hiroshima study was one of the first, and was of that type. And furthermore, it was Japanese women, and already there was Japanese women wasn't the done thing to smoke. Peter Lee had the theory that, first of all, there was little doubt that there was a relationship between husband and wife smoking. If the husband smoked, a wife was more likely to smoke. These things ran in families. There was about a fourfold increased risk of the other partner smoking if one smoked. From that, it only took a fairly small number of people who were actually true sneaky smokers to turn around and say that they were non-smokers, and you warped the figures quite a bit. The first passive smoking studies showed relative risks approaching 2. And I remember sitting down and trying to do this from a biological point of view, again a dose-response viewpoint, because we did human smoking studies, and we knew that people in a smoky environment, but not smokers themselves, might inhale half to 1 cigarette a day. Certainly wasn't 10. So really, a relative risk of 2 was way, way, way beyond what the biologically implied risk was. The biologically implied risk in passive smoking might have been somewhere around 1.1, but the early studies were all coming out, 1.5 to 2. Now, undoubtedly, risk of bias here. It's a pity we hadn't had Chris's funnel plots and so on in those days, but I think there'd have been little doubt that the funnel plot would have shown off bias. Anyway, we decided to run a lifestyle study, which I don't know if we'd have got ethical approval for it these days, because I mean, it purported to be a lifestyle study, but the real reason for the study was to get cottoning samples from people. We asked them to give us a saliva sample, and the saliva samples were analysed for salivary cottoning, which of course is an afterthought of nicotine. And from that, we actually discovered, this was in the UK, not in Japan, we discovered that about 2.5%. And that's all you needed to suddenly turn what would be, let's say, a passive smoking risk of 1.1 into a passive smoking risk of 1.4 or 1.5. At that time, the tobacco industry were quite happy to try and get a handle and show that the passive smoking risk wasn't that massive, even though the alternative to this was that it meant that, if anything, the active smoking risk had been underestimated for years. You know, you don't get something for nothing in this. Never did. But an interesting time anyway. But I just wonder if that, would we today be allowed to run a study like that where actually the objective was somewhat hidden? No. Even if our intentions were. How we doing? There's just, again, got involved in sales weighted average TAR, and you can see that the industry impact was a steady reduction in TAR year on year, because it's the black one there. And Gallaher's, they used to put their figures together. They were happy enough. They're quite an ethical company, Gallaher's actually. They were quite happy as long as they were below the sales weighted average TAR for the UK as a whole. After all, they had particularly put their future, if you like, on low tar cigarettes, so they wanted to be coming in just a little bit below the average. Let's move on. So 1988 suddenly saw a move from Henry Street. This is the old tobacco factory at Lisnafill, and it's to close in the next few months. So it really is the end of an era. But as I moved to Lisnafill, there were a few new things I got involved in. First of all, I argued, and this time they'd given me not just statistics to look after, but the routine laboratories as well. And there was all the hassle of moving to Ballymena. And I got the hold of the then director of R&D, who was a guy called Dick Boxall. Didn't live much longer after that. Dick would have been a biochemist by trade. But I said, look, we're on the move. There's hassle anyway. Why don't we take the opportunity to actually introduce a computerized laboratory management system? And so he bought it. I managed to get Gallaher to spend £250,000, so it did. It was the most I ever got anybody to do. It meant there were some weeks and months downtime whenever we did move to Ballymena, but at least we restarted with a nice new laboratory management system. Now, let me tell you, never once in Gallaher's did I come across a case of being told to do something that would have been against your principles. I know I wasn't involved in selling cigarettes, but never did I come across any results, being treated in the wrong way. There was a very strong work ethic and ethical view on data and so on. Never any problem with it whatsoever. But nonetheless, I was enthusiastic about this, and you could still tell, if you like, it was still coming from those days back in Queens, whenever the abuse of, just giving that result. This would actually mean that we'd move towards an audit trail for laboratory results, and eventually it moved Gallaher's on to quality standards, accreditation, and so on. Now, coming into my sort of last days in Gallaher's, as I say, I was doing lots of air miles to London, but by 1990, they'd never sent me any further afield. And then European harmonization came on the horizon. Now, there's our type of cigarette smoking machine, a linear one. This picture here is a German Borgwald rotary smoker. These two machines, they're purporting to do the same thing, but they don't, because the rotary smoker is rotary and sets up an air current as it goes round, and the linear one isn't. And I sat on a group watching, and we were all involved in collaborative experiments and so on, using certain brands of cigarettes and so on, until we eventually we actually put an airflow across the linear smokers, until we got to the point anyway that standard cigarettes, that's 84mm filter cigarettes and 100mm standard cigarettes, at least gave the similar or the same results on both types of smoking machine. And the meetings to discuss those took place in Rome, in Paris, and Gallaher's flew a club class even to Rome. You know where you go EasyJet and so on these days? Oh no, it's all club class then. So it was great for the air miles, no doubt about it. There's the business of harmonization. I don't know where we'd be without Europe and its harmonization. You'll see that there were two standards noted there. Yes, of course there were two standards, because one related to linear smoking machines and one related to the rotary. And then it says here, the National European Standardization Institutes are working on ISO standards for measuring tar nicotine yields of tobacco products other than cigarettes, and I've put rolling tobacco there, because again I got involved when the industry saw that government, Europe, were going to do something. They were proactive. So we got together and said, tell you what, we'll try and solve this particular one. We came up with all sorts of models, and actually the business of sitting on a group looking at rolling tobacco meant that even when I left Gallaher's in 1995, I continued to work as a consultant, aided and abetted actually by Rossman's, it would have been, or do you remember the little tobacco factory, Murray's Tobacco Factory? The one just over the Boyne Bridge. The wee building is still there. It's a lovely building. Yet the owners of it continued to employ me on a part-time basis, even when I joined Queen's in 1995. And bang on time. That's a checkered history. I had a couple more slides with other things in it. You may wonder why I've got the gold block with me. One of my colleagues, Robert Beattie, got involved in multivariate experiments. You see, Gallaher's had a mass spectrometer, which could give you multivariate chemical data. But we also had multivariate sensory data. And he got involved in things like canonical correlations and factor analysis. And there was a very interesting study that he did on pipe tobaccos. Why have I brought this? This has been lying in my cupboard for about 20 years. And they did this two-dimensional diagram of, first two factors of these pipe tobaccos. And there was a whole grouping of pipe tobaccos together, and you could immediately see them. They were traditional English pipe tobaccos, Cronders and Bruno, brands like that. Then there was another batch of tobaccos on the chart together, and they were all the aromatics, the ones that with coumarin and smell like vanilla and that kind of thing. I'm trying to remember the names and so on. Holland House was one of them, and so on. But the smelly aromatics were all in a little group together. And then there was this one brand sitting on its own called Gold Block. And the reason why Gold Block was sitting on its own was because it has the aroma of a standard English brand, but the texture similar to the aromatics. And so they didn't know quite where to put it. So it was out on its own. And which brought me back to an adage that I always had. I'll finish with this. An adage all my statistical life. And that is, if the final result you get doesn't look sensible, you probably got it wrong. And in that particular case, I can tell you that Robert Beattie and his team, I think, had got it absolutely right. right. So,
very, very good talk. Michael, it brings back many memories, and it brings back memory of Gallaher's actually subsidizing the local group of the RSS at one time. And it brings me to the debate where I challenged you on this very point.
Yes.
And at that time, I remember you were a very powerful advocate for Gallaher's and all their activities, as is evidenced, I think, by your talk today. So my question is, how eventually did you come to agree with all of us in epidemiology?
Well, I think that the truth of that, Gilbert, is that I never disagreed with you. A lot of people sort of think, oh, well, you know, the tobacco industry took one particular view in this. They didn't. And this is a good question, because let's go back to the 1980s. I sat in rooms with Peter Lee and Richard Peto and Julian Peto and so on, discussing these things in a rational way, and it was not a case that the tobacco industry did not believe there was a link between smoking and lung cancer, or between emphysema and lung cancer. They pretty well did. And in fact, if anything, there was more honesty in the 1970s and 1980s than eventually in the 1990s. The reason why I left the company was actually I got bored and had nothing more to do. And if you ask, well, why was that? Were you just a lazy so-and-so? Yes, it was. But there was also the element of the lawyers coming into play. Now, before lawyers, industry people and government scientists and so on would sit down and have a rational conversation about these things. When the lawyers came in, they basically said, you're not talking to them, we're going to work in the middle, and guess who got rich? And it wasn't the government statisticians or the government people, and it wasn't even the industry people either. The lawyers did very well out of it. But the problem was that once lawyers came in, there wasn't really much for me to do. You know? Actually, there were more honest conversations before the lawyers got involved. And the business of the lawyers getting involved, it started in America, which was very legalistic. But then the disease, if you like, eventually, you know, crept over to us. You were asking about sponsorship and so on too in the tobacco. I never had any problem with the tobacco industry sponsoring anything it liked, particularly if it was for societal good. And I count sponsoring the RSS as being for societal good. I count sponsoring the Ulster Orchestra as for societal good, and I count leaving a legacy of money for Northside. When they left Henry Street in 1988, a pot of money was left. I mean, I think even GP surgeries benefited from that when they went. So also, if you watched how they operated as a company in Ballymena, I know they might be making a product that has issues about it, but when it came to the local environment, they were out checking the water for effluent and doing all the things we're supposed to be doing nowadays. But you know, so in other words, they had a green side to them, and you might say, well, they were probably doing that because they didn't want to be to end up being, you know, in it for anything other than the product that they make. Nevertheless, I mean, there have been other companies that haven't been as you know, haven't worried about the environment as much.
The other question that springs to mind based on what you've said is if you think back, you may tell us how you think the advocates of public health, I was one of them, how could we have tackled the industry more effectively at the time?
I don't know. I think you did ultimately do it quite effectively, even to overdoing it. But let me just tell a story on that. Years later, 2003, I'm at a conference in Cork. I'm now working for CRSC, Clinical Research Support Centre. So for now, I'm actually employed by the National Health, if you like, in inverted commas, rather than Queen's University. And we had as a guest speaker there Richard Peto. And the Republic had just introduced the workplace smoking ban, which of course meant you couldn't smoke in pubs and places like that too. And very interesting, Richard Peto got asked the question, what do you think of the Republic's smoking ban? We didn't do it in Northern Ireland here until 2007, but it was done in 2003 in the Republic. And I don't think many people in that room understood the answer they got, because Richard Peto turned around and said, yes, very good idea. It's going to save the lives of many active smokers. But this was all about passive smoking. You see, society overdid the passive smoking one. But the interesting thing was, because I could understand exactly where Peter was coming from, and Peter was not he was not in the paymaster of the tobacco industry, but he had noted that first of all, product modification, going down from average sales weighted tar 20 milligrams to 6 milligrams, whatever it is today, had an impact. But also, the workplace, if you can't smoke when you're at work, then you smoke less. Because at best, you get you see them outside some of these sweatshops, whether it's telephone centres and so on. They're allowed 5 minutes for a comfort break or a smoke break every hour. Well, you have to have that because you have to get away from the computer, don't you? You get repetitive strain injury. So it's a quick dash out. So your 60-a-day person can't do it anymore unless they're unemployed or something, So actually, the strange thing is that the smoking bans had more impact on active smokers than on passive smokers, where actually the risk was always pretty small anyway.
Okay, so I just open up if there's any other questions in the audience. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick one, since we're of the same generation. My thoughts of the difference between how statistics has changed over the years is the impact of the computer.
Oh, absolutely.
And you haven't mentioned that at all.
I know, and I was going to mention that, but it's really a bit on time. But when I joined Gallaher's, as I say, Bertie O'Neill did look after a data group, and that included computer services. Now, at that stage, they had a PDP-11, with Anthony, would you remember what that was, with Fortran programming on it. So there were some little bits of, I remember getting asked to program a median test and then getting in real trouble because it shouldn't be the statistician doing this. This was something that the computer services people should do. Oh, that was David Smale setting me up right away. He was in a dispute with the computer services manager, so get your new recruit in as the fall guy. Nevertheless, that's where we were at that stage. We did experiment with, the little, not Commodore 64, but that type of thing in the 1970s. The first computer we had only had, 1 kilobyte or something on it. 1 kilobyte or 1 megabyte. 1 kilobyte. But the then computer services manager in 1984 bought our first PC, and from then it just snowballed. And I also had the role of computer services manager at various times along my career, indeed, and particularly toward the end of it. And I have to say, I used that slightly as plotting my way out, because if we were all going to computers on a desk, I wanted one so that I could see what was going on. I'd like heck see what was going on. I wanted one so they would install, there was a package called Stat Graphics, which at least was reasonably user-based in those days. We had SPSS on the mainframe and we had SAS on the mainframe, but it was all, I was the manager, other people were doing the work, and so I got Stat Graphics on a desk PC and got myself used to, running my own stuff. And therefore, when I did come to Queen's, it was a fairly simple move to go from Stat Graphics on a PC to then, by that stage, SPSS was then into sort of PC variant. So there you are.
Okay, so I think perhaps we're running just short of time for the webinar, but I just maybe want to give our sure appreciation to Mike for giving us